Abalone, or abalone, for those of you that don't know, are a marine gastropod, a univalve mollusk, or an underwater snail in simple terms. Abalone are considered a treasure from the ocean and a delicacy to Asian consumers, but tough as old boots and were called mutton fish by the early white settlers. Stock enhancement or reseeding is taking brood stock abalone parents from the wild, breeding them in captivity, raising baby abalone to a size that they are then seeded back onto the natural reefs. Abalone are broadcast spawners. Males and females aggregate together at spawning time and release millions of eggs into the water column. Fertilisation takes place and they'll become microscopic shrimp-like things for a few days and then settle on a particular coralline algae and start growing a shell. They are cryptic until about 60 millimetres in length. I wish to convey my gratitude to the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation and Nuffield Australia for funding my adventure around the world. I wish to thank my country hosts for helping with organisation and for being such legends. I also wish to thank my beautiful partner Pepita, who found me away for 15 weeks in the first year of our relationship. She now lives with me in Streaky Bay along with our gorgeous 8-week-old daughter Raya. I'm a professional abalone diver of 20 years from the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. I work with my brother Tobin. Tobin, his wife Carissa and I now run the family business, which consists of 2 abalone licences, harvesting and exporting abalone into East Asia. A quick overview of Australia's abalone fishery. Diving is conducted using surface supplied air from a boat. Commercial harvesting started in the 50s and 60s, and quotas, which is putting a limit on the annual catch, were implemented in the mid to late 80s. In 2018, our total allowable commercial catch is at 2,900 tonne, which consists of mainly blacklip and some greenlip. Stock enhancement has only really occurred in a trial that started in 2004 in Western Australia, and they did have good results. You can see from the graph that we had, after quotas implemented in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a bit of a decline, and since then we've had a slow rebuilding of the biomass. It was because the fishing pressure was controlled and it had been reduced. Then that slow recovery was increased with good recruitments in the late 90s, and from 2002 to 2006 there was a large spawning biomass on the reefs, the largest it had been in 15 years, and recovery was happening nicely. Then it dived, excuse the pun. What was happening to recruitment? Why are the larvae or baby abalone not surviving? How could we overcome this? Something was happening when the baby abalone were in their early larval and settlement stage, when they are at their most vulnerable. Can we nurse them through this stage in a hatchery, reseed them when they are stronger and enhance the reefs and increase commercial production? That was my main objective, to see if there was an answer, who was doing it and how. So off I went to Florida in the USA. Now there's no abalone in Florida, but there is Professors Ken Leber and Kai Lawrenson, and they are the gurus in fisheries stock enhancement. I went there to learn about genetic diversity and genetic fitness. The broodstock selection is really important when it comes to genetic diversity, and sourcing from the location that you intend to reseed is the key. Use many tens of males and females and change them regularly. This helps with then the genetic fitness. So the juvenile abalone, if they are too small and not strong enough, they can still be susceptible to the environmental bottleneck mortality. But if they're too big, they can be too domesticated and find it difficult to adapt when they go back onto the reefs. Around 30 millimetres in length was considered the ideal as the trade-off between survival and cost. The 2 professors are the authors of the Responsible Approach 2010, which is a great paper that provides the fundamentals of fishery stock enhancement. And you can see up in the corner there, they are not the professors, but I came across Chuck, Bill and Boots, some Vietnam vets that were drinking Foster's oil cans. Needless to say, I sat down and had a couple with them. Off to New Zealand, where they dive for pawa, which is the Maori name for abalone. It's a breath hold fishery, and they're producing about 800 tonnes, which is actually half of its more recent annual average. New Zealand's pawa fishery is well managed, and there's a very good peak industry body, the Pawa Industry Council. And you can see me there with Dr. Tom McCowan, the Chief Scientist with the Pawa Industry Council. In talking with him and the stock enhancement that they had been undertaking, he said it's been really difficult to determine the results from the trials, and that a large trial using catch per unit effort, or kilograms per hour, would be needed as a performance indicator to really determine success. This would need $1 million plus investment, and currently the security of that investment is low, because they have some real poaching issues, which is the illegal take, and sedimentation from agricultural runoff, particularly the forestry industry. After the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016, it's going to provide a great opportunity for them to trial some larger scale reseeding, because the government is making a decent investment and the community is really behind wanting to re-establish the reefs that actually lifted up out of the water. Dr. McCowan also wants to try rotation harvesting, which is resting areas, and translocation, taking faster growing pawa and putting them back onto the reefs so that they can help establish it quicker. Predation upon release has been an issue in the trials, and you can see the release modules there that they've been designing to try and protect the baby abalone from starfish and crabs and fish. I travelled to Japan, which was quite fascinating, up to the Iwate prefecture, which is on the northeastern side. And it bore the brunt of the tsunami as well back in 2011. In Iwate, there's 27 co-ops that were producing around 300 tonne, which makes a fair amount of Japan's total 1,360. They use a strange method for harvesting called hooking, and you can see Mr. Abe there showing you how the hooking works, and that pole there's a pole that's about 5 to 7 metres beyond that, with a fisher that will be leaning over the side of their boat with a viewing glass, hooking the awabe off of the substrate. They do this in winter because the water is so cold. In the Otsuchi co-op that I visited, there are 180 permit holders, and they work 4 mornings a year in November for 3.5 hours and 3 mornings a year in December for 3 hours. It's an Olympic style fishery, and there's no individual quotas, but there is a total zone quota for the fisheries co-op. And despite 35 years plus of stock enhancement, which I'll get to next, their harvest has been reducing, and they believe it has a lot to do with the water temperature, where there's a current that runs down the eastern side, and it can be too warm and too cold in certain years, meaning that the baby abalone don't get through. They're also thinking that they're having some issues with recruitment because of all of the breakwall construction, and they're changing the natural water flows along the coastline. With regards to their stock enhancement in the Iwate prefecture, they're reseeding 9 million awabi seed a year. They say that it makes up 30% of their total harvest. They get a survival of 10 to 15%, and their size at release is that 30 mil. The seed is heavily subsidised by the prefecture government. Their methods of release range from the fishers themselves just dumping buckets over the side onto the reef that they think looks good, to hand releasing by divers, but that is time consuming and costly. Reseeding or fishing in general has priority over adjacent land activity like forestry. And the one thing that I took away from the Japanese is they understand the ecology of the release area, the settlements of the awabi at the various depths, the algae that they need to live on, and when their predators such as the octopus are out in the deeper water, that's the time that they go and place the seed out there. I went to California. The commercial fishery was closed back in 1997, and the recreational breath hold dive fishery, which was consisting of about 450 tonne for the big Californian reds, has been closed this year due to bad warm water events and algal blooms. They first started trying stock enhancement back in the 70s with the red abalone, but there's been many experiments over many decades with limited to unknown success. They've tried using larval release and dispensing by hand. One of the, in talking with Dr. Rogers, she was showing me this video of a PVC pipe dispenser that had a door that released after 18 hours from sitting and conditioning on the bottom. They had filmed some of these, and there were very opportunistic octopus just sitting there waiting for the door to open so they could have some dinner. A lot of work has been done at the Baja Bay Research Lab on saving the endangered white abalone, and they have some ready to release, but because they have been in the hatchery for so long, I can't help but feel that they'll face that genetic fitness challenge and they'll be far too domesticated. I travelled on down to Baja California, Mexico, where there's a commercial surface supply dive fishery for abalones. They have species of greens, blacks, pinks and reds. There's a limited diving season in winter and spring, and they do have quotas. They're currently producing about 360 tonne, which is a third of their more recent annual average production. So they too are experiencing decline harvests. There's 16 co-ops that have been delegated local area management, and part of their licences is that they must undertake reseeding. There's 6 subsidised hatcheries providing the seed for the co-ops, but there's no guidance or measuring of the success of that reseeding. They tell me they've tried many methods from larval release up to 40 mil in size with no standouts, and the government is currently working to try and develop a plan to improve the results and justify the investment by government. I travelled over to South Africa, where there is a very small commercial dive fishery for pearl of about 200 tonne and a massive illegal poaching issue of about 2,000 tonne. I was really interested to visit the Wild Coast Abalone farm at Port Elizabeth, where they have been reseeding with excess farm stock from 30 to 40 mil. They have very low cost of production. Their electricity is some of the lowest in the world, as is their wages. They have been granted a lease, a 10-year lease over a stretch of coastline where they're putting the baby abalone out, and because of the poaching issues, they've had to employ a security team. And I was very fortunate to take part or observe one of the major reseeding events. And in doing diving around there, particularly in the shallows, I could see a lot of natural recovery. So it appeared that because they'd stopped the poaching, the wild abalone were naturally recruiting, and those ones were displacing the ones that they were reseeding. So they're reviewing the terms of the lease to see if they can actually take some of the natural recovering stock as well, because the original was only what they reseeded, but they might find that they will have very little to harvest. One thing that also occurred to me was that there was a lot of double handling, and to minimise that, you have greater survival. I've just put up here a seed cost comparison of my travels around the world, and you can see there's a huge range in what it costs. Another of my objectives was to go to the market into Asia and see the consumer perception. Would we still be able to achieve the premium price for wild abalone if it started its life in a hatchery? So I talked with 5 or 6 of the biggest importers, and they told me that stock enhanced products already exist in the marketplace, particularly from Japan, like the awabi, scallops, salmon, eels, and there's been no adverse effects to the price. They also said that it's actually a good story. By stock enhancing, you are ensuring sustainability of the abalone species, but just ensure that it's safe with no antibiotics and no chemicals. In conclusion, every abalone fishery is experiencing declining stocks driven by environmental factors and then subsequently overfishing. Management responses must be quick. Reseeding is in its infancy other than Japan. It is expensive and currently security of investment is low. It will work in select locations by understanding the ecology of these locations, combined with rotation harvesting because resting areas works too. Genetic fitness is key to survival and success. The size at release seems best at around 30 mil. Larval reseeding is yet to work in any of the countries that I've visited, and it's best to keep handling to a minimum to increase the survival upon release. My recommendations are to share knowledge and partner with aquaculture. We in the Wild Harvest in Australia don't have the best relationship with aquaculture, but they understand the early life cycle of the abalone. Form a global working group of expert skill sets to explore and steer stock enhancement, because as I found out, we're all doing the same thing. We're all on this learning journey. Ensure the governance arrangements are sufficient to provide the security necessary to make the investment. So we need to make sure that the abalone that we release onto the reefs won't be compromised by other activities. Be inclusive and transparent for the community support. They, as we're finding out, are as interested in us as what's going on in their backyard. Develop a project and start identifying the suitable reefs to undertake this venture, and tell the good story of stock enhancement. It's being a little bit presumptuous, but I believe it will play a big part in the future of abalone in Australia, if not the world. Thank you.